All right. And I'm recording this, everybody, just so you know, so we'll have a copy of it. But yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. Really glad for Annette and Jillian's willingness to be involved and take time from their day to speak to everyone about CPT and a lot of the great resources from ISSS. Please keep in mind that some of the processes have changed on our end, the CMC end, just a little bit. We'll be talking about that more as we go on, but if you talk to second years and things sound slightly different, do keep in mind that there are things that are a little bit different, mostly behind the scenes because of a lot of what's been going on with COVID. But with that said, I'll turn it over to Annette and Jillian from ISSS, and we'll go from there.
Okay, all right, let me share my screen here. Okay, all right, so we are going to talk about CPT, Curricular Practical Training, for F1 international students. So it's an F1 benefit, obviously, so you would need to be an F1 student to make use of it. We'll talk about how, understanding what CPT is and how it works, how eligibility works, and that is sort of a twofold thing. It includes both the opportunity as well as the students. Since this is a sort of an F1 benefit, there's some eligibility requirements around when students can engage in CPT. Making a plan for using CPT, and then the approval and application process and how that works. So when we look at how CPT is defined, one thing to keep in mind is that the regulation itself allows for individual schools to tailor it to their curriculum, because it is a curricular-based work authorization or a type of authorization. So the key phrase in the regulations is that it's an integral part of an established curriculum. They go on to say that it can be a part of an alternative work-study situation, internship, cooperative education, or any other type of required internship or practicum. Usually there's some sort of a sponsored relationship, so sometimes it is employment, sometimes it's not employment. All of that is sort of covered under the umbrella of CPT. The takeaway there is that it should be ideally a structured academic experience that's a component of your degree program. So whether it's an optional component or a required component, it still is something that is connected to your curriculum, connected to your degree program. So in that sense, it's different from employment, because it isn't just work authorization for the sake of authorizing employment. It does still have to meet that standard of being an integral part of an established curriculum. So we'll always be looking at, with CPT requests, how does this relate back to your program? And it's a little bit higher of a bar than it's just related. It's got to be tied into your program a little bit more. So when we look at training versus employment, this is the other thing that can get a little weird about CPT, is that it is a type of work authorization, but it also authorizes training, and training and employment aren't always synonymous. So it would be possible for something to be training and not employment, and on the other side for something to be employment but not training. So while CPT does give work authorization, it gives work authorization for training opportunities, and not just work authorization for work. Does that make sense? I feel like I've talked myself into a corner. All right, so when we look at how the Department of Labor defines training, and whether they consider something to be employment or is it training for the benefit of a student. So usually this is an academically structured experience. It's connected to an academic program, course, or requirement. There are learning goals and objectives, and the training is for the benefit of the student rather than the benefit of the employer or the training site. And there's not a promise of a job following the end of the training. When we look at employment, just plain and simple, it's providing services in exchange for compensation. So someone hires you to do a job, and they're going to pay you to do that job, and you need permission to accept that pay. It's a job that exists whether you're a student or not a student. You're being paid to do something for the employer. And, it's not a temporary thing. This is a job you've been hired into, and there's an expectation that you're going to continue. So, that would be employment without the training aspect. The pieces that add training to employment that make it eligible for CPT, it's the internship component or the practicum component or the experiential requirement component, if that makes sense. When we look at unpaid training, we sometimes have to go into that same evaluation. So previously, before a lot of the changes that happened with immigration policy over the last several years, we did not require CPT for unpaid training experiences, but it was recommended because oftentimes you don't find out if something was employment until after the fact, especially in cases where the payment is non-standard or non-traditional. So for unpaid training, you still would need to request CPT, especially if it's going to be off campus. So what we usually recommend is that you check with us before accepting an off-campus opportunity to see if it's unpaid, to see whether CPT would be required. You always want to be careful around accepting work and not having work permission, because that is an issue with F1 status. That essentially that's a status violation, and any sort of a status issue that involves unauthorized employment, that gets really difficult to resolve, and it can sort of have long-lasting implications. So when we look at volunteering, which is often something else that gets a little murky for F1 students, when we look at volunteering, it's not just a matter of did you receive money or not. It really comes down to the activity. So is the activity that you're doing something that you should be paid for? Is it something that's usually performed by employees? Does the fact that you're a person in a non-immigrant status affect whether or not this is a volunteer activity? So then when we look at those things, we have to look a little deeper into some of the other contributing factors there. So we're looking again at the Department of Labor perspective on what constitutes employment, and also the Department of Homeland Security perspective on practical training and compensation. It's really important to remember that, even when you're interacting with employers, that you are the gatekeeper for your status. So if someone who is trying to hire you is telling you, oh yeah, you don't need work authorization for that, that's great that that's their understanding of it, but you want to make sure that that's accurate, because the person who bears the harshest brunt of those consequences would be you if in the end it's determined that you did need work authorization for that. So it's always a good practice to confirm whether work authorization is needed, especially if someone's telling you that, no, this is you can do this as a volunteer, you don't need it. So when we look at volunteering, very simple definition, it is a donation of your personal time. Often it's for something that's humanitarian or civic in nature. Everyone who ever does this is unpaid. It's always a volunteer situation. It doesn't involve any sort of compensation or any sort of remuneration of any kind. So those would be volunteer activities. Where an unpaid or volunteer activity could become training or employment, is the activity something that is usually paid? So does the organization have other people here doing that same role that they're having you do? Those folks are receiving money. You're not receiving any money. We have to look at why is that? Is it because, they don't want it to be complicated because you're an F1 student? Or how is this then volunteer if they've got both paid and unpaid folks doing the same thing? Then it gets a little more involved if what you're doing is directly related to your major and you're doing it for the purposes of gaining practical experience. Then that can sometimes trigger the need for some type of practical training coverage. But if no one ever receives, if it's always done as a volunteer, no one receives money for that, then, volunteering in that area is usually okay. It's something that you would just want to have a conversation about before starting it, just to make sure that you don't need anything. So then when we look at curricular practical training, how is it different from optional practical training? So in the regulations, they're situated in the same place. Practical training is its main identity, and then it's separated out into curricular and optional. One of the major differences is that curricular practical training is pre-completion only. That means that it only exists while you're working toward the completion of your program. Once you've satisfied all of your degree requirements, then there's no longer a way to justify authorizing CPT. So while you're still working towards the degree, CPT is possible. For OPT, it's both. It can be used on both a pre- and post-completion basis, but you're drawing from the same 12 months. So if you chose to use some of your OPT on a pre-completion basis, you can do that. But however much you use will be subtracted from the 12 months you have to request once you graduate. CPT is employer and location specific, whereas OPT, once you have the work authorization, you can work for anybody. So you don't need a job offer in advance to apply for OPT, but you do need that for CPT because we authorize it specifically for that location, that employer, and the dates that you'll be with that employer. A CPT is an in-house authorization as opposed to OPT, so you don't have to send anything out to United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. You make a request to the school that has your CPS record, and then they process that, and the authorization is issued on a new I-20 for you. For our campus, we usually ask you to turn that in at least 2 weeks before you want to start, just to avoid unintentionally delaying your start date. Sometimes we need some additional information, so you want to allow a little time for back and forth. It can be paid or unpaid. So again, like we've been talking about, it really it comes down to is this training, and often that will come down to, is this off campus or is it on campus? And if it is off campus, then usually you're going to need some type of work permission for that. And then for CPT, you're always going to have to come back to this academic anchor. So how is this an integral part of an established curriculum? For us, that would come down to either a required course, an optional course, or a degree requirement. So you're looking at what is the academic foundation for this practical experience. On the OPT side, you can't do full-time during the year, and you're limited to how many days of unemployment you can accumulate, and that doesn't apply to the CPT because it is a curricular activity. Does that make sense the way I've talked about that? Any questions on this part before we move on?
I have a question.
Okay. Yeah.
That academic anchor, is there anything we have to do, or is there anything we have to prove for that being an academic anchor, or it's just not required? I don't know if my question is clear.
I think so. So I'll answer what I think you're asking, and then tell me if I did not, in fact, hit the target. So for ON students, for any Vanderbilt student, if you're requesting the CPT, you're going to have to tie it back to one of those things. It's either a course that you're taking that has a practical component that you have to take. It's an optional. That's a course you have the option to take to get credit for a practical experience, or it is a degree requirement. So your program may require you to do a practicum or an internship experience. So for ON students, and I guess we can sort of hit pause here and jump into that, there are a few different academic anchors, one being course-based, or a couple of different options for course-based, and then this year for students starting this year, there's an experiential learning requirement. And Brooke, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I can hop on that some. So I'll say, and this is something that is new this year. When I mentioned that things have kind of changed from how we've done CPT at Owen from this year to years past, this is sort of the main thing that's changed. The last class used, almost everyone used that management. It was in the end of their first year used management 6902. And this year we have the experiential learning requirement. So so I think that will serve for the academic anchor for almost everybody over this summer. We're still in the midst of, Annette and I may be probably talking a little bit after this, even as we kind of continue to get the details ironed out for what that looks like. But it is there, and I think the good news is probably the main thing that you're going to need to do is just be letting us know what it is that you're going to be working on over the summer, which in the simplest form will most likely just be filling out the information in 1220, updating us with what you're going to be up to this summer. Hopefully that helps, Annette, and please hop in if any more clarification on that.
Yes, thank you. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
You're completely fine. No, you're good.
Okay. Okay. So, yeah, so there are a couple of different options for Owen students for this starting this year, but depending on, you know, is this your first opportunity? Is this a repeat opportunity? That will sort of guide to which option you're using to anchor the CPT.
And this may be a good time to bring up too, if, again, we're kind of ironing some of the details out, but the experiential learning requirement, you'll have the ability to use that for another semester if things kind of continue with your employer. But if you're looking at kind of doing other work with other employers or kind of more than just that time frame, that would be reasons to be talking with myself and also with ISSS on other CPT options.
Okay. Does that answer your question, Alejandro?
Yeah, that does. I guess when we do that work, when we send the documents for the CPT website, do we have to specify that, or we just get to email you and let you know that that's the route we're going?
Yeah, so that would be pulled out in your CPT application.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, that answered my question.
I think so in the CPT application, I'll take care of that. And maybe if this is an okay point, and then I'll point out, it mentions the academic anchor, and there's also a recommender that we'll be talking about. And for CPT, I'll be the academic recommender. That's different for OPT, one of the many differences between CPT and OPT. But yeah, so that will kind of help take care of that. And then, you know, again, we're talking mostly about kind of stuff for the summer. If, you know, a couple months into next year, if you're interested in doing a part-time, you know, unpaid role during the school year, which is not an option to my understanding for first year MBAs, but is an option after you've been a student here for after your first year, then that's something, again, reach out and talk to us, and myself and as well as the folks at ISSS to weigh the different options at that point too.
Okay, so then when we're looking at eligibility, so that was a perfect segue. So for F1 students, you have to have been full-time enrolled for an academic year to have access to the CPT or off-campus work permission. There's an exception for graduate students whose programs require immediate participation. The other exception would be if you're an F1 student who transferred your CBIS record from your previous school to Vanderbilt, then you've already satisfied that off-campus work eligibility requirement. So there's some flexibility there, but within the context of the Owen program, then the earliest availability would be the summer, your first summer semester. Have to be making normal progress towards the completion of your degree. Normal progress often gets a little murky, but that essentially means that you're on track for how long you've been in the program. So if you are you've been in the program for 3 semesters, but you've got the credits of someone that's been doing it for 1 semester, that would not be normal. And then your program's not yet completed. Like we talked about, CPT is a pre-completion benefit, so it only exists when you're still working towards the completion of your program. Once you've met all degree requirements, then we don't really have any justification for authorizing or continuing to authorize CPT. So that's where that gets a little tricky. And we couldn't extend an I-20 just for the purposes of authorizing CPT. That's where you'd want to look at post-completion OPT, unless it's an unfinished degree requirement and there is an academic or medical reason that you didn't finish everything on time. So that's the one case where we could look at an extension. Is the opportunity eligible? So it has to be directly related to your major field of study. If this is going to happen during the fall or the spring, then you have to still continue to be full-time. You have to be able to still be a full-time enrolled student. And then that's by actual credit hours for coursework programs. And the training then still has to satisfy that piece of being an integral part of an established curriculum. So this is where we get to what is the academic anchor for your opportunity. So again, on our campus, that's a required course with a practical component, an optional course for practical components, or a degree requirement. And you would need to identify that each time you're requesting CPT authorization. So basic standard CPT scenarios, you're in a program that has an internship practicum, some sort of practical requirement. Yes, that is CPT eligible. And enrollment, if it's happening during the fall or spring, you've got to be full-time. And then if there's enrollment attached to the requirement, you need to be enrolled in whatever course that is. Program does not require an internship, but you've got the option of taking one. Taking an internship course, that qualifies for CPT. You would need to be enrolled in the internship course, and if that's happening during the fall or spring, you'd still need to be a full-time student, but that internship course does count towards that if it's credit-bearing. If your program has a research requirement, yes, that qualifies. This is where it gets a little different. The job has to also be fulfilling the research requirements. So it would have to specifically be meeting that research component. If enrollment exists, then you'd have to be enrolled in that. And I think I'll probably skip these first two and just get down to this last one. I've got a job offer. It's related to a course I took last semester. So this is something that is a little tricky to do with CPT, and this may not be possible under CPT. This would maybe be a pre-completion OPT scenario. But if this does qualify for CPT, and we'd need a little bit more information to determine that, then of course a CPT eligible course would be required. And same thing, if you've got a job offer, it's related to a course you're taking right now, but this is it's a coursework course. It doesn't involve a practical component. This may not qualify, so that's pretty much the same scenario as before. And if you've got a job offer that's not related to your major at all, but there are relatable skills, this would be an area where neither CPT or OPT would apply, because they both have that requirement that they have to be directly related to, that the activity has to be directly related to your major field of study. So when we look at some ON CPT scenarios, if you are enrolled in Management 6902 in the current year, then you would be able to use that as your basis for CPT over the summer. If you, this is where I guess it gets a little weird because these are first-year students, so these first two scenarios may not really apply to you. If you had taken Management 6902 already and wanted to repeat, you could do that, and it would have to be based on a separate section. If you're fulfilling the experiential learning requirement, that does count as an academic anchor for the CPT, and it does not require enrollment since it is a degree requirement. So it's possible for if it's based on a degree requirement, it's not necessary for, does not necessarily require enrollment. Then the last one, if you've got an offer to work on a consulting project with your professor, client is based outside of the university. So depending on how this is set up, you may need CPT, you may need to be enrolled in a course, so we would need some more information to sort that out. Okay, so who's not eligible, like we mentioned before, once you've met all of your degree requirements for your program, then there's no longer a basis for issuing CPT. There wouldn't be a basis for extending the CPT unless it's required for the degree program and you qualify for an extension. How much of the CPT can you use? It is available without limit, and that kind of rolls over for each educational level. So you can request multiple authorizations. However, you do want to keep in mind that if you're granted a year or more of full-time CPT, then you're no longer eligible for your OPT benefit. And that does mean a full 365 days. You keeping in mind that all of the work permissions that are available through the F1 status are going to be educational in nature. They're going to be referring back to or looking back towards your degree in some way. Every time you request CPT, you would have to meet the eligibility requirements. The opportunity would have to meet the eligibility requirements. And when we're looking at counting CPT, if your opportunity is 20 hours or less, then that would be part-time authorization. Full-time is considered anything over 20 hours per week. And it's not an average, but it's the actual hours per week. So if you've got an opportunity and it's part-time except for 3 weeks where there's this project where it's all hands on deck and everybody works about 60 hours a week, you'd have to have full-time authorization because we wouldn't be able to flip-flop between part-time and full-time. So if any portion of your internship will be full-time, you'd have to have full-time permission. And it counts calendar days during the authorization period. So between the start date and the end date, that's how much CPT you've used. Some things to keep in mind, we usually don't issue CPT for multiple semesters based on a single course. This varies by program. So how your program sets up courses that give you access to practical experience will depend on whether this is true for you. So in the case of course-based CPT and the ON, there's usually a separate section. Extensions for your CPT period may not be possible, and that just means if an employer asks you to work longer than your originally agreed upon time, you want to make sure that you can extend the work permission before you agree to that. So for us, that comes back down to a bit of the academic program, what the academic program will allow, as well as if this is a full-time experience, there's some hard cutoffs there. Usually you wouldn't be able to continue a full-time experience beyond the end of the summer. That would have to switch to part-time. So you just want to be aware that there's some conversations that have to happen before you can agree to extend your time with an employer. And then when we issue CPT, typically it lines up with the dates of the semester of your course, if it's course-based. And then for non-course-based CPT, then we're looking at, we look back to the academic requirement and how the length of time that you have to engage in to meet that. In some cases, we can be a bit flexible, but it wouldn't really overlap semesters. So it's not that you could have a 7-month period of time and you start in October and you end in April, just for a weird example. Usually it's going to break along the lines of the semester. If there are any changes to your practical training, they have to be approved before they can take effect. So let's say that you requested part-time curricular practical training, and then you find out after your first week on the job that they're going to need you to be full-time. You couldn't just start working full-time. You'd have to get that updated I-20 that reflects full-time CPT authorization before you could change. And because it's specific to the site, so same thing if you find out that you're going to be at 3 sites instead of just 1, before you can be active at those other sites, you'd want to have that updated and reflected on your I-20. And I've mentioned this already, but we wouldn't be able to sort of switch back and forth between part-time and full-time in the same authorization. So usually when we issue it, it's part-time for the entire duration or full-time for the entire duration. And even though what you get at the end is a paper I-20 or just an I-20, it still is binding as if it had been an EA card from the government. So you can't start before the start date that's listed on your CPT I-20 or continue after the end date that's listed there. So some basic timelines for the fall and spring semesters. If it's based on a course, you would need to be in that course and apply for the CPT by the end of the add-drop period for the term. And then the dates would line up with the dates of the semester. For summer CPT requests, if it's based on a course, you'd have to be enrolled in that. But if in this case, if we're looking at the experiential learning requirement, or 6902, there's no course for the experiential learning requirement, and the 6902 is asynchronous. But the earliest you could start was the beginning of Maymester. The latest would be the end of the summer term. And then if it's based on a program requirement, and this will vary by program, then we're looking at the program parameters for that. But in general, unless there's something specific, then it lines up with semester dates. And then if there's something that needs to continue beyond one semester, we would do that in multiple authorizations. So we wouldn't issue one continuous period. So that would be if, the summer is your first term, and then you have an option to continue in the fall, and that's allowed by your program, you'd have a summer CPT and a fall CPT. Okay, let's see. I think I'm going to skip over this for right now. So then when we look at the opportunity, again, it's got to have an academic anchor. It has to be directly related to your major field of study. Payment, it can be paid or unpaid. It can be anywhere in the U.S. If you're not going to be in Nashville, keep in mind you still have to report any changes in your local address within 10 calendar days. It can be remote. If it is going to be remote, then that would need to be included in either your letter or some email communication. Right now, I think I'm getting ahead of myself just a bit, but we do have, under the current COVID flexibilities, we do have permission to issue CPT for remote internships under a couple of circumstances, which we'll get to in just a moment. So one of the things you will need for CPT is an employer offer letter, and that letter needs to list some basic information. So it should be on letterhead, should have a signature from the company representative on it. We would need to know the employer's name, the location where the training is going to occur. So if you are hired or placed there through a placement agency and they will pay you but you're located somewhere else, we would need that information for both who's issuing the payment as well as where you're going to be doing the activity. And if you're going to have more than one site, then you would need to give us that information for every site where you'd be active. Your offer letter also needs to list specifically when your training will begin and when it will end, because we have to put that into your authorization. So specifically what day, month, year it'll begin, day, month, year that it will end. how many hours per week will you be working, and this is used to determine if you need full-time or part-time authorization. And if you are, so if the letters, often the letters are standard, or companies use standard letters. So if there are some of these elements that we need that are not included in the standard offer letter, you can confirm those in email and just upload both the offer letter and the email with the additional details. Okay, so you can do remote internships in a couple of cases if the employer has a branch in the location where you will be remote, or if they have a means of providing supervision remotely. So in those two cases, then we would still be able to approve CPT for remote work. If your opportunity will involve remote work, then you want to be sure that you've got that documentation from the company, whether it's in the letter or you've confirmed this or they notified you via email. That's the piece that you would want to upload along with your offer letter. Okay, so making your plan for the CPT, you know, so this would be your conversations with Brooke and the folks in the CMC, finding out, you know, going through their whole process of locating internships. On our end, you want to make sure that you know what timelines apply and what's needed from your program. So again, this is going to just come down to the CPT application, having your offer letter, and applying on time to get your CPT I-20. Okay, so you've done this first part, you've gone to a session, you're working with Brooke and the folks in the CMC. Once you've got your offer letter, then, and you have all the details that you need, then you're going to apply for the CPT in the ISSS portal. And I'm going to pause here and hop over to that screen for just a moment. Okay. And in the portal, one of the easiest ways to get there Sorry, I should have done this before. Give me one moment. Okay, so from your user homepage, if you search online requests, then you're going to go down to employment authorizations and curricular practical training. In this case, you'd be requesting for summer, and you would start your application. If you already have an application in the system, it will take you back to that application. It won't let you start multiple applications for the same term. And this part has been taking a little bit for some reason, so play Jeopardy music here. Do. Okay, short-circuited. All right, so this is the page that you get. The instructions, our panel is over here on the left. The to-do items are here on the right side. So you're going to fill in your employment information with the specific start date and end date, whether this is full-time, and the employer's details, and then a brief description. So in this case, if you're doing this based on the experiential requirement, then you would reference that here, and then you're going to submit that. If you have more than one site, then you'll provide that information in the second one. You still have to fill this one in. Even if you don't, you would just say that, no, I don't have more than one site, and submit. Then you're going to select, and then you're going to send a request for the academic confirmation here through the recommendation page. So when you click on this link, and let me, oops, sorry. I need to move this down a bit. No. Okay. When you select the recommendation, it's going to open up, well, I'll just, since this is who you'll be choosing, you're going to type in Brooke's name. When you hit next, it will give you a space to type in any message that you need to tell him, and then you'll go ahead and save, and it will send a request to him. This box will stay empty, but you can still go ahead and submit once you've uploaded your necessary documents. And then once it's completed, this will change from an empty box to a checked box. Then you're going to upload your offer letter. And if you have some of the information in an email, you'll upload that. Then you want to be sure that you hit the submit button. So right now, we're still issuing documents electronically. So once your CPT has been approved, we will upload a scanned copy of your signed CPT I-20 here to the attached documents area, and that's where you'll get that. We usually also follow up with sending you the hard copy in the mail. Sometimes the scans, once you've printed it 3 or 4 times or copied it 3 or 4 times, it's not the easiest thing to read. So in case you need a clearer copy, we are sending those in the mail, but you'll have your electronic way to provide to your. One thing to note is that if you do not have a Social Security number, you'll need to apply for the social, but you can only do it within 30 days of your start date as listed on your CPT I-20. So the timing of that will get a little interesting, especially if you need a city, if relocating to another city to do. Right now, the Social Security Administration is not open, office in Nashville is not open to the public, and you have to call and make an appointment, and they've been taking about 8 weeks to schedule those appointments, to call you back and schedule. So that's something that you'll want to think about how you're going to navigate that process if you have to apply for your Social Security number before starting. Okay, so
Annette,
when you're, oh, yeah.
And I'll hop on that too, if that's all right. So Anshi is on this call too. He's he's a Peabody student that's working in our office, and he recently went through that process. So feel free, any of you, if you want to hear from someone who went through it. He went through it just a couple of weeks ago when he started working with our office. If one example can help, talk to him about that. And I think he's also going to try to summarize just some of the steps that he went through, if that can help others too. So I think he's working on that, and I'm going to take a look at that, and we'll get that sent out here too. So just if that can help. But certainly, I mean, ISSS, they have helped a lot of students last year with sticky SSN situations. So thank you.
So then when your authorization is issued, you'll get a new I-20. Nothing is changing on the front page of your document. Your authorization will show up on the second page. You want to hang on to this because this is your proof that you had work permission. This will only print out on your I-20 while it's valid. So if you think, we recommend that you preserve your CPT I-20 because that's your proof of work permission. And this is the only time that we can generate it is while it's valid. So you will need to do an I-9 with your employer, and you do want to make sure you've got your CPT I-20, your passport, your I-94 with you when it's time for you to do that. Okay, so just summarizing, remember that you're the gatekeeper for your status. There absolutely are no stupid questions, so if you have any doubts, any questions, feel free to reach out to one of us and have a conversation to make sure you understand what's needed to keep your status in good shape. And you'll want to make a plan for accessing your CPT and when you're going to apply. If you have any questions, let us know. Then absolutely you want to apply at least 5 days before you want to start. I would recommend 2 weeks before, just to give enough time in case we need some additional information. And then you have to have your CPT authorized before you can actually start working. If you're going to be in another city, remember that you still have to update your local address. So this would be in your YES portal under personal information, your local mailing address. You'd update it within 10 days of moving to the new city, and then update it again within 10 days of moving back to Nashville. So that is it. Any questions? Okay. Well, either I did a really bad job and nobody wants to tell me,
I just have
yeah,
one question.
go ahead.
If we have all the documents ready, can we go ahead and apply? Or do you rather have us wait all the way to the 2 weeks? Just because my internship starts on the 7th of June, and I'm taking like a month off. I'm going to Colombia in May. I haven't been since I started school, so I don't want to be like. I'd rather leave that CPT, that I-20 before I leave the country. If not, I'll just change my plans to be here 2 weeks before.
No. So in this case, if really, and whether it was course-based or based on the degree requirement, in both cases, you could submit that application now if you have all of the components. Okay.
And then for the component of it's being 100% remote, we got an email from the company that I guess I can submit the email as my proof that it's going to be remote. Okay.
Right.
And then Brooke, we would have to say that it's a requirement for the class, right? For the program, or
yeah,
or
yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure I click the right one. I
know I'm not sure what all looks on your end, but I know on our end when we're filling out the recommender form, yes, at that point, certainly mentioning is the experiential learning requirement. Is that what, or is there?
Oh, go ahead.
Is there a certain place, Alejandro, that you're wondering about where you need to add that, or who you need to tell about that?
No, it's because during the onboarding, one thing to say, I can't complete my I-9 until I have my CPT. So the email I got from them while onboarding, it says apply for your CPT immediately and request an effective day of June 7th. So and then it says your appointment for I-9 will not go into effect until I have all the documents. So that's what I was asking, kind of, I don't know. It's kind of weird. They just want us to have it ready. I don't know. Because I have the social security number and all that stuff. I'm missing just the CPT and the new I-20.
Yeah, so in our application in the portal, it would be number 11 in the questionnaire. That's where you would reference the experiential learning requirement.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Glad you're working on this now. Sounds like they want it. So yeah.
Yeah. They want it right away. I know I sent you that email, so that's why I just want to make sure. I'll go ahead and upload those documents.
That sounds great.
Thank you guys. Really make it easy.
Any other questions? Anything else we can help with?
Maybe one thing I'll hop in on while anybody else is waiting to see if they have questions. Something I'll just say, because typically a lot of ON students apply for CPT for over the summer, and then they'll apply for OPT closer to graduation. And you may remember that slide of CPT, OPT differences, but I think in my mind, 3 big things to keep in mind when you're thinking about next year. One is that OPT takes far longer to process. OPT you'll work on with ISSS, but you'll eventually send it off to USCIS, and it can take months to process, where CPT is all done at ON. It can take usually around a week or 2 at tops. So keep in mind that there's a big difference with timing there. Another big difference for next year is OPT. You don't have to have an offer. CPT, you do. So yeah. And then just also there's a difference on the ON side of our office helps more with CPT, whereas the student programs office in GRE is more of the contact for next year for OPT. Well, I mean, next year we'll have hopefully Annette and Jillian will come back once again and do another some sessions on OPT. Some of you may have already joined those, but just keep in mind that there are some differences. It does not look the same from this year to next.
All right, well, that's all we have. If there's nothing else, we can hang around for a little bit if anybody's got additional questions.
Great, that sounds good. Thank you both, Annette and Jillian, so much for your time and for doing this. We very much appreciate it. But yeah, I think we'll sign off from there. And yeah, feel free to stick around if you have questions. All right, thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.